What happened when a maid and a billionaire gave in to a forbidden desire? Could their love survive the weight of power, secrecy, and betrayal? When their worlds collided, who would be left standing? And who would be shattered by the truth? As hearts broke and choices were made, was there ever a chance for them to escape the lives they were trapped in? If you're hooked, like and subscribe for more intense twists, and hit the bell to never miss the drama. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. In the grand, isolated mansion of the enigmatic billionaire, Emma, the young maid, moved quietly through its vast hallways, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors. The mansion was a world of its own, elegant, detached, a place where secrets whispered through the air, like the dust that settled in the corners of the towering rooms. The billionaire, Alexander Winters, was a name known only in hushed tones, his fortune built on industries that ran silently in the background of the world. At 36, he had everything most people dreamed of: wealth, power, influence. Yet, there was a coldness to him, a distant air that kept everyone at arm's length, and Emma was no exception. Emma had been working at Winters's mansion for over a year. She was strong-willed, independent, and fiercely proud of the job she had secured. Her position as a maid wasn't a reflection of her ambitions. It was simply a stepping stone to a better life. She had learned early on that in this house, boundaries were not just expected. They were demanded. She was to remain in the shadows, unseen and unheard, tending to the tasks that kept the mansion running smoothly. She never once allowed herself to cross the invisible line between servant and master. But there were moments, fleeting and dangerous, when she couldn't help but notice him. Alexander Winters, the man who owned this world. He was often in the library, his broad shoulders hunched over piles of papers, or in his office, staring at the skyline, detached from everything. His sharp features were often hidden behind a veil of mystery. His eyes, when they did meet hers, which wasn't often, held a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Emma had heard rumors about him. His reputation as a recluse and a heartless businessman preceded him. But what captured her attention was something that wasn't in the rumors. It was the sadness, the grief that sometimes flickered in his eyes, hidden behind an impenetrable mask of control. As she cleaned his study one afternoon, the temptation to glimpse at him was irresistible. He stood by the window, his back to her, and she had the rare opportunity to study him. He was a man who seemed as though the world had never been able to touch him, yet the weariness in his posture told a different story. A story of a man haunted by ghosts. But what ghosts? She forced herself to turn back to the desk, pretending to be absorbed in her task, but her thoughts strayed to him. She caught herself wondering what it would be like if she could speak to him beyond the boundaries of her position. It happened on a rainy evening. The winds howled, rattling the windows of the mansion, and Emma was assigned the task of delivering a tray of tea to Alexander's private library. The storm had knocked out the power, and there was a tension in the air that evening, one that set Emma's heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. She hesitated at the door before knocking softly. "Come in," a deep voice called from inside. Emma's fingers tightened around the doorknob as she stepped inside, the warmth of the room offering little comfort against the chill she felt creeping into her bones. Alexander stood by the bookshelf. As he often did, his figure outlined against the dimming light outside. He didn't look up as she entered, lost in the world of his thoughts, or perhaps lost in the world he had created around him. She approached the desk and set the tray down, her heart beating erratically as she caught sight of him from the corner of her eye. The silence stretched between them before she broke it, her voice almost too soft to be heard. "I hope I didn't disturb you, Mr. Winters." He turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The moment their eyes locked, something shifted. An electric current that passed between them, charging the air with something dangerous, something undeniable. "No," he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You're not disturbing me, Emma." Her name on his lips caused her breath to catch. It wasn't the first time he had spoken to her, but this time there was a shift in the way he looked at her. It was no longer just a glance of indifference. It was something deeper, something more probing. Emma's fingers fluttered nervously at her side, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Will you be needing anything else, sir?" she asked, though she knew there was no real reason to stay. He seemed to think for a moment, his gaze still lingering on her. "Actually, yes," he said, stepping closer to the desk. "Could you stay for a moment? I've been meaning to ask you something." Her pulse quickened, and she hesitated, but only for a second. Of course, it wasn't anything unusual, just a brief conversation about the storm, the state of the house. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. The more they spoke, the more she realized how much they both avoided acknowledging the tension between them. It was there, in the way their words danced around the real question. How long could they both ignore the undeniable attraction? Over the following weeks, their interactions became more frequent, and the distance between them seemed to shrink, even though they never crossed the invisible boundary between them. Emma's heart would race every time he walked into a room, and she could sense the change in him as well. Alexander's eyes would linger on her, not out of disrespect, but rather curiosity, as though he was trying to decipher a puzzle that he couldn't quite solve. There were moments when they would catch each other's gaze, and for a heartbeat, the world would pause. The quiet hum of the mansion would fall away, and all Emma could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She would look away, pretending not to notice, while Alexander would often find himself seeking out her presence in rooms he knew she would be. Neither of them dared to acknowledge the unspoken chemistry that simmered just beneath the surface. But they both knew that things could never be more than this. A dance of glances, stolen moments, and quiet, unsaid words. Neither was willing to step out of the lines they had drawn. Yet, the more they avoided the inevitable, the more their connection deepened. The tension between them grew thicker until it was no longer something they could ignore. The days blurred together in a whirlwind of stolen moments and secret glances. What had started as an unspoken attraction soon transformed into something more. Emma's presence in Alexander's life had shifted from occasional interactions to a rhythm that neither of them could escape. The mansion, once an imposing place of isolation, had become their sanctuary, a space where they could forget the world outside and indulge in a passion that both thrilled and terrified them. It happened one evening after dinner. Alexander had asked her to stay a little longer to assist with some paperwork. The mansion's grandeur was less imposing at night, softened by the warmth of the dimly lit rooms. They stood in his private study, surrounded by shelves of old books and framed memories of his past life, a life Emma had only ever caught glimpses of. There was a silence between them, the air thick with unspoken words. Emma stood near the window, her back to him, staring out into the dark, her mind racing. She couldn't believe she was here again, alone with him in his private world where nobody else could see them. She tried to focus on the rain falling outside, anything to push away the thoughts that crept into her mind. But she couldn't escape him. Not now, not ever. "Emma." His voice came from behind her, low and steady. She didn't turn, but she felt the heat of his presence drawing closer. "Why are you avoiding me?" She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She wasn't avoiding him, but how could she explain the pull, the gravity that seemed to bind them? Turning slowly, she faced him, their eyes locking in a silent exchange of longing and hesitation. "I'm not avoiding you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't want to make things more difficult than they already are." Alexander took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as if to study her soul. "I don't think it's possible to make things more difficult than they already are." In that moment, she knew. The tension that had been building between them reached its breaking point. Without another word, he closed the gap, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both gentle and urgent. It was a kiss that had been building for months, a kiss that erased all the doubts and boundaries they had placed between them. Emma responded with equal fervor, her hands gripping his shirt as if grounding herself to reality. They didn't speak after that. The only sound filling the room was the rapid beating of their hearts as they gave in completely to the desire they had fought so hard to suppress. The affair had begun. In the days that followed, the once carefully constructed barriers between them were obliterated. The mansion, with its sprawling hallways and countless rooms, became the stage for their secret encounters. Emma would slip into Alexander's private study late at night, when the house was quiet and the staff had long since retired. In those stolen hours, they were free. Free from the expectations of society, free from the roles they had been assigned. Their intimacy was intoxicating. Each moment felt like an escape from the world that separated them. Yet, as much as they gave in to their passion, there was always the reminder, the knowledge that this could never be anything more than an illicit affair. Emma reminded herself constantly that she was the maid, and Alexander was the billionaire. A man whose life was built on power and control. A life where a woman like her had no place. She could never let herself forget that. But despite the guilt that gnawed at her, Emma found herself drawn to him more and more. She wanted to believe in something more than the confines of her role, to believe that love, or whatever this was, could be real. But every time their hands touched, every time their lips met, the weight of reality loomed over her. Alexander had his demons, and she had her own, and they both knew the stakes of crossing the line. For Alexander, it was even more complicated. His cold, distant demeanor had always been a shield he had erected to protect himself from the pain that had come with the loss of his family, his past, his humanity. He wasn't supposed to let anyone in. But with Emma, the walls he had so carefully constructed began to crumble. The warmth of her touch, the softness of her voice, broke through his defenses. It scared him. He wasn't used to vulnerability. He didn't know how to handle the feelings Emma stirred in him. But he couldn't stop himself. The guilt he carried was heavy, and he wondered if she knew how much of himself he was giving away. He told himself it was only physical, that this affair meant nothing more than a release, a way to silence the memories that haunted him. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore the growing attachment, the deeper emotional connection that was blooming between them. Emma noticed it too, the way his touch lingered a little longer, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, as though he saw something more in her than the maid who cleaned his house. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when she could see the man beneath the wealth and power, a man who was just as broken as she was. And in those moments, Emma dared to hope. But she knew it could never be more than this. The reality of their situation weighed heavily on her, and no matter how strong the pull between them, she could never forget who they were. A maid and a billionaire, separated by far more than just wealth. The affair, like all illicit things, was fragile. It was built on secrecy and desire, and though it burned brightly in those stolen hours, Emma knew it could never last. Yet, in her heart, she clung to a fleeting thought. What if, just for a moment, they could escape their worlds and create something real? It was a dangerous thought, one that she tried to push away, but it lingered, like a spark threatening to ignite something neither of them were ready to face. The days of secrecy and stolen moments had created a world for Emma that felt almost tangible. A world where she could imagine a future with Alexander, a future where their roles didn't define them, where their love was the only thing that mattered. She would catch herself dreaming of it during the quiet hours of the night when she should have been asleep, her heart beating faster as she thought of a life where she wasn't just the maid, and he wasn't just the billionaire. But dreams, as she was about to learn, were fragile things. They could shatter in an instant. started with a simple, seemingly innocent misunderstanding. Alexander had asked her to stay after her usual duties, a gesture she had come to expect on rare occasions. She thought nothing of it when she entered his study, tray in hand, only to see him talking to another woman. A woman whose beauty was undeniable, whose presence in his life was immediately apparent. She was a business associate, or so Alexander had said, but there was something about the way they spoke to each other that made Emma's heart sink. The intimacy between them, the closeness, was something Emma could never share with him. For a moment she stood there, invisible in the background, watching them. She didn't know what to think or feel. Was this woman a part of Alexander's life in a way Emma could never be? Was it just a business transaction, or was there more to it? She stepped back, carefully placing the tray down and retreating, but the sight had already done its damage. She couldn't erase the image of their closeness from her mind. It wasn't just a business conversation. It was something else, something Emma was not part of. When Alexander later found her in the hallway, she couldn't hide the hurt in her eyes. He saw it, or perhaps he chose to acknowledge it. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his emotions began to crack. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words died on her lips. The truth of the situation was impossible to ignore any longer. She wasn't just the maid to him. She was the other woman. Nothing more than a fleeting distraction. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. But it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. A bitter silence stretched between them, the weight of her feelings too heavy to bear. She had imagined something more, something real. But all she could see now was the insurmountable divide between them. The wealth, the power, the status he had would always come first. She was nothing more than an escape, a fleeting desire, not someone he would ever truly choose. In the silence of the night, Emma sat in the small, empty room she called her own, the weight of reality crushing her chest. She had been living in a fantasy, one that she had created in her mind, convinced that it was possible for them to break free from their worlds and be together. But the truth was harsh. Alexander would never choose her, not over the life he had built, not over the expectations that came with his name. She had always known this, but in that moment it became impossible to ignore. She had given so much of herself to him, but what had it all been for? She had lost sight of herself in the process. The dreams, the fantasies, they had been nothing more than a mirage, a fleeting hope that had only led her to a painful reality. Her heart ached as she looked back on their time together, realizing that she had let herself be swept up in the idea of him, not the man himself. The guilt weighed on her, too. How had she let herself believe in something so impossible? She had known the rules from the start, knew that there was no place for her in his world. Yet, somehow, she had allowed herself to think that they could both escape it, that their connection could transcend everything that divided them. But it couldn't. And deep down, she had always known that. The next morning, Alexander appeared at her door, his face a mixture of regret and resolve. She could see it in his eyes. The conflict, the guilt, the sense that he had lost something that he wasn't sure he could live without. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said, his voice tight. Whatever this is between us, it can't continue." Her chest tightened at his words, and she fought to keep her composure. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words that followed felt like a punch to her gut. "I care about you, but I can't give you what you want. I can't be who you need me to be." It felt like the world had stopped spinning. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but nothing had prepared her for the crushing weight of it. The dream, the future she had so desperately clung to, was over. Emma closed her eyes, letting the tears fall. But she didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. No matter how much it hurt, she knew this was the only way. They couldn't have it all, not in this world. Alexander took a step closer, as though he wanted to say more, but she shook her head, unable to look at him any longer. The walls had come down, but the distance between them was now insurmountable. "I'll leave," she said, her voice steady despite the heartbreak that shattered her inside. "It's for the best." He nodded, unable to speak, and watched as she walked away, disappearing into the vast emptiness of the mansion. The affair that had once consumed them both now felt like a distant memory, one that neither of them would ever be able to forget. Their final conversation, the one they both knew would come, was marked by pain and loss. There were no final promises, no hopes for the future, only a deep, unspoken understanding that this was the end of something beautiful, something fleeting, something they could never have again. They both walked away from each other, heartbroken, lost, and yearning for something that was always just out of reach. They had been two people who found each other in the chaos of their own lives, only to realize that their worlds could never truly collide. And in the silence that followed, they both knew that they had lost something precious, something that could have been, but now it was gone. Life after the affair had taken on a rhythm of its own. Emma left the mansion, leaving behind not just the opulence and cold luxury of Alexander's world, but also the man she had fallen in love with. Or perhaps the man she had dreamed of. The mansion was no longer her prison, but it was also no longer her escape. She moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the mansion's grandiose walls that had once held the possibility of a future. She tried to rebuild, piece by fragile piece, but the cracks in her heart were deep. It had been harder than she imagined. No matter how far she pushed him from her mind, she still felt his presence everywhere. The memories of their stolen moments haunted her, the intimacy they shared now nothing more than a ghost of what could have been. Every day was a battle to forget. Emma took on a new job at a small cafe, serving coffee and pastries to people who barely noticed her. She buried herself in work, surrounded by faces she would never know. She tried to fill the emptiness that Alexander had left, but it felt as though the ache was embedded too deep. She wasn't just heartbroken, she was shattered, her sense of self eroded by a love that had never truly been hers. Her phone remained silent, save for the occasional message from friends, none of whom knew the truth about what had happened. She kept the lie intact, even as her heart broke every time she thought of him. She tried to convince herself that she was better off, that leaving him behind was the right thing to do. But the reality was far messier. She had lost herself in him, and now she had to figure out how to find herself again. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Alexander faced the consequences of his own actions. His life had been reduced to the cold efficiency of his empire. The mansion, once a place of comfort, now felt like a tomb. He spent his days in boardrooms, his nights in solitude. But no matter how much he threw himself into work, something was missing. The emptiness he felt had a name: Emma. He thought about her every day. The way her eyes had softened when she looked at him, the way she laughed, the way she cared for him when he never allowed anyone to do so. He had pushed her away, convinced that his world, his money, his power, his control, would always come first. But in the aftermath, he realized how much he had been lying to himself. He had tried to move on, telling himself that the affair had been nothing more than a fleeting indulgence, a distraction. But the guilt that gnawed at him, the emptiness that lingered after she left, made it impossible to ignore. He had taken her for granted, believing she would always be there, and now he was left with nothing but regret. And so, after months of living in the shadow of his own choices, Alexander made the decision to find her, to fix what he had broken. He couldn't stand the silence any longer. He had to make amends, even if he didn't know how. When he finally found her, it was in a small cafe, tucked away in a corner of the city. Emma looked different, stronger, independent. She didn't notice him at first. Her back turned as she spoke to a customer. But the moment she turned around, their eyes met. And for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Emma. His voice was low, filled with both hope and uncertainty. She froze, as if the sound of her name had transported her back to a time she had tried so hard to leave behind. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was steady, though her heart was racing. She had thought she was done with him, that she had moved on. But seeing him again stirred something deep within her, a vulnerability she had worked so hard to suppress. "I've made a mess of things," he said, stepping closer, though he stopped just short of crossing the line. "I've thought about you every day since you left. I can't keep pretending it didn't matter." Emma swallowed hard, trying to mask the rush of emotions that surged through her. "It didn't matter, Alexander. It was never supposed to matter." "I know," he replied, his voice raw with regret. "But it did. More than I ever let myself admit. I pushed you away, and now I'm paying the price." She looked at him, her heart torn between the woman she had been, the one who loved him with every part of her being, and the woman she had become, the one who had learned the hard way that love was not enough to bridge the divide between them. "I've changed. Emma, I'm not the same person who let you go. I want to make things right. I can't live with the way things ended between us," he said, his voice pleading, almost desperate. But Emma had changed too. The woman who had once believed in the fairy tale had transformed into someone who no longer wanted to sacrifice herself for someone who couldn't commit to her. She had found strength in her independence, and while she still cared for him, she couldn't go back to the way things had been. "I've learned something in all this," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I can't keep waiting for someone to choose me when I'm not even sure I know who I am anymore." Alexander's face fell, the weight of her words settling in. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but he knew he had no right. She had already given him so much, and he had nothing left to offer but regret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside continued on, unaware of the quiet battle unfolding in the small cafe. Finally, Emma took a deep breath and stood up. "I have to go," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was breaking. "It's time for me to move on, for good." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, lost in the silence of his own mistakes. The story ends with Emma standing at a crossroads, her future uncertain. She could return to the world she once dreamed of, a world that had always seemed just out of reach. Or she could continue down the path she had started, one where she learned to be her own person, free from the man who had once defined her. But in the end, it wasn't a question of what she would do next. It was a question of who she had become. She had learned the hard way that love, power, and self-worth were more complex than she had ever imagined. And now, as she stepped into the unknown, she knew one thing for sure. She would never again be the woman who waited.